So we're doing a bit of a rewind in John, turning back to John chapter 6. I'm going to look at the verses that Joyce kindly read for us earlier. So I guess most of us in our life have been responsible for planning some sort of big event. Maybe for a wedding of a son or a daughter, you've been involved in various bits of it. Imagine, you've got it all worked out, everything's okay, except the caterer lets you down at the last minute. And that kind of panic, what on earth am I going to do? Well, multiply the numbers up a bit. This isn't a wedding with perhaps 100, 150. This is more like a few thousand at a conference gathering. And this is in London, where there's loads of shops just down the road that we can all go to. This is a country venue, and the nearest shop is a good distance away. Feeding of the 5,000. It's the only miracle that's recorded in all four Gospels. It's so well known, and yet perhaps it's not so well known. A lot of people know it as a Sunday school story, but John is at pains to tell us that this is no story. He said he was there, he saw it. He was actually in the story itself. He was one of the disciples taking round the loaves of bread to the crowd. He was there. And so in his first letter that bears his name, John insists that this and other accounts were eyewitness evidence. He says, from the very first day we were there, taking it all in. We heard it with our own eyes, saw it with our own, heard it with our own ears, verified it with our own hands. The word of life appeared right before our eyes. We saw it happen. We saw it, we heard it, and now we're telling you. So John didn't just record this as a story. He told it to tell us some important information that he felt he is compelled to pass on to us. So what's happening here? What's kind of going on? Well, I guess it's a bit like an impromptu conference. So Jesus is the main conference speaker, and there's a huge crowd that's gathered, not just from the immediate locality, but from all around and from some distance. And of course, no one had booked a caterer. No one had thought about that. And so what are they going to do? Well, Andrew steps in, verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? We just had Labour Party conference season. And can you imagine Keir Starmer giving his keynote speech, and at the end of it says, I have to say to conference, I'm really sorry, but our caterer has let us down. But it's okay, don't worry. My Chancellor has just been down to Tesco and done a deal. So we've got 4 loaves. Yep, we've got some loaves. That's okay. We'll be okay because my Chancellor's got a suggestion. Oh, and just to sort of make sure we don't go short, we've got a tin of tuna to go with it. Can you imagine it? Can you think of the response you'd get? Can you think of the laughter? Can you think of the derision? Well, it's probably the same here in our account. The Gospels at various points record some of the banter between the disciples. And most of it isn't very complimentary, if you're honest. But you can kind of imagine the reaction here as Andrew comes up with a boy with his loaves and fish. You know, hooray! Andrew saves the day. Where would we be without Andrew? And turn around to each other and go, what a complete idiot. You can just kind of sense it, can't you? A few barley loaves and some fish. And yet Jesus takes them and from that makes enough food to feed a huge crowd. John estimates 5,000 men. Try to imagine, you're there, you're one of the disciples, and it just keeps coming and coming. Jesus just keeps breaking the bread. And the end of it, there's basketfuls left over. It must have been a jaw-dropping moment. It's one of those kind of wow moments. And I was there, says John, and I saw it. So John tells us he's not interested in this just to fill a few Sunday school lessons over the centuries. He says in verse 14 that it was a sign. So in verse 14 it says, after the people saw the sign Jesus had performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. A sign. We've all seen signs going down the road. Sign points your direction. Sign gives you information. Might tell you to stop, or a speed limit, or tell you which way to turn. It gives you information. It tells you something important. So if this was a sign, what is Jesus trying to tell us through this account? Well, the first thing I see here for this sign is the Lord of creation. We see here the Lord of creation. We live in a beautiful world. You have to look all around you and you see a wonderful world filled with evidence of a creator. People everywhere, wherever you go, however civilized or remote, however educated or apparently ignorant, everyone everywhere in all cultures has some notion of a creating mind behind the world and the universe. I remember a guy at our previous church who we briefly got to know. He'd been embroiled in drugs and in gangs. He'd spent time in prison at Her Majesty's pleasure. And as he came out, he'd been contacted and had played football with a church where he was. And a family agreed to put him up when he came out of prison. And he said he really struggled with some of the things that they did and some of the things they believed. But at one point, he sat on a park bench and he looked out and he said, I saw a flower. And it just dawned on me, someone made it. Someone made it. And he said, I don't know how theologically correct it was, he says, but I did a deal with God. And he's now a pastor in Scotland. Someone made it, he said. There has to be a creator. You look at the intricacy of the world, of our minds, of the things all around us. There has to be a creator. But here in John's account, there is something truly remarkable, because here is a man creating with his own hands, multiplying bread. There's no cloning going on here. There's no 3D printers installed around that can somehow form a loaf of bread. It's just made by breaking the loaves and passing them round. This is no ordinary man. This is no ordinary prophet. Here is someone who can create all at his word, in his hands. The loaves and fishes multiply sufficient to feed a large crowd. We all know how the harvest works. You plant the seed germinates, it has to have time to grow and mature, it then ripens in the sun, you harvest it, you mill it and produce flour, but not here. It's just coming out of his hands. He just breaks the bread. The cynic says that actually, really, everyone had brought their packed lunch with them. And it took the boy to bring his out for everyone to get theirs out. You know, stuffed down the back of their tunics somewhere, they had their roll and their sandwiches. And, oh, it's okay, I'm not going to have to share it with someone else, so I'll get it out. Well, apart from the fact that that very much went against the culture of their day, it doesn't explain what happened afterwards. In verse 14 and 15, the people saw the sign Jesus had performed and began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew from a mountain by himself. They wanted to make him king. They'd seen it and they wanted to make this man king by force. You don't do that if you know you just brought your sandwich out your back pocket. I mean, you know, how stupid do you think that they really are? They'd seen something marvellous and their reaction says it all. This is no ordinary man. This is no Old Testament prophet. And this wasn't an isolated instance. The gospel is full of accounts that the disciples saw and witnessed and couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. You remember when they're out on the lake and there was the storm and they're in the boat, and here are these experienced fishermen and they're petrified because it's going to sink, and they wait Jesus, and at his word he stills the storm. And the accounts tell us they look at each other and they say, who is this? Who is this? He healed the sick. He made the paralytic walk. He raised the dead. He cast out the demons. And the Gospels tell us those accounts in order for us to see something of who Jesus is. He tells us that here is the Lord of creation. He multiplies the loaves. He stills the storm. They all know his voice. They know who he is. A couple of weeks ago, looking at a similar theme, and we asked the question that we often ask, why doesn't God show up on a hurting, broken world full of conflict and pain and suffering? Why doesn't God show up? And the Bible tells us he has. He has shown up in the person of Jesus Christ. No mere man, here is the Lord of creation himself, creating food from his hands. And the question for you and me is, what do we do with this God-man? What do we make of him? How have we responded to him? If God has shown up, if God has become one of us, if God has entered into history, surely we should sit up and take notice. And is that just a message for folk who are some out there, not Christians, never believed? It should challenge those of us too who are Christians here. Do we recognize who Jesus Christ is? He's not your chum. He's not your mate. He's not your pal. He's not there to do your bidding. We're not here as a club. We're here to worship the Lord himself, God who became man, God who came as one of us in compassion and love. Surely we should be here with worship and praise to recognize him and give him his rightful place as King of our hearts. And so often that drifts and we forget. And we need to remind ourselves, who is it who is Lord this morning? So the Lord of creation. But secondly, you see here a lesson from loaves. A lesson from loaves. So Jesus turns to Philip in verses 5 and 6, sees the great crowd, and he says to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Philip must have been an accountant in a previous life, because you can almost see him getting out the calculator and starting to put the numbers in. So, okay, let's say we get one takeaway sandwich between 4. It's only a kind of bite each, but it's better than nothing. And that's 5,000 odd at a guess, yep. And the minimum wage is currently £11.44, so that's 8 months' salary. It's not going to work. How are we going to do that? That's not going to work. Whoa, what are we going to do? I haven't got the remotest clue, is basically what he says. And as you look at the reactions, there's a contrast being drawn here. On the one hand, between Jesus' sovereignty and his calmness, and on the other hand, with the disciples' helplessness and uncertainty. What are we going to do? You can almost see them looking round at each other. What are we going to do? Well, I don't know. Beats me. Well, don't look at me. Don't look at me. I haven't got the answer. And yet Jesus says already had in mind what he was going to do. He was in control. He knew. And so he puts the question to Philip to test him, it says. One translation puts it like this. He said this to stretch Philip's faith. There was a lesson from the loaves. Jesus is simply saying, you can't, but I can. Put it all in my hands and trust me. So simple. You can't, but I can. The disciples have run out of ideas. And sometimes that's us, and maybe that's you this morning. You're confused. You've no idea what to do. There are things that you just feel you're out of control in life. And what do I do? Maybe things you don't want to face, like a doctor's appointment. Maybe you've got difficulties with family or other relationships. You don't know what to do. Maybe just things that circumstances of life that you feel as if you're almost just hanging on in there. What Jesus is showing us here is we're never intended to try and work out life on our own. He hasn't left us to say, well, there you go, fallen and broken world, make of it what you want. He says to us, look, you're never intended to do that. You can't, but I can. Put it all in my hands and trust me. No situation is too hard for him. His power is the same as when he broke the loaves and distributed it to the 5,000. He doesn't have compassion fatigue like you and me. His love and compassion for us this morning are the same as it was when he looked out and saw the crowd and sensed their need and fed them. And he's never too busy to bother with little old you and me. As he dealt with the crowd, as he dealt with the disciples, so he will deal with you and with me and our circumstances if we put it all into his hands. Jesus would simply say to you and me this morning, you can't, but I can. Nothing too hard for him. And so the simple question for you and me is, are we trusting him? Are we putting it all in his hands? Or are we desperately trying to stay in control of life and manipulate it ourselves? So as the Lord of creation, there's a lesson from loaves. The third thing this tells us is the loaves that last. The loaves that last. So the response of the crowd is quite volatile and dramatic. For me, it's got echoes of scenes in America after the last election when Donald Trump lost. Do you remember watching the scenes and the violence that erupted and all the things that happened? Except, of course, then it was the failed leader who was manipulating the crowd, or so we believe. But here, of course, Jesus isn't the one doing that, but it kind of has that feel about it. It's almost as if the crowd is ready to start posting on social media. Right, get ready, get your friends. We're all going to march on Jerusalem and make this Jesus king by force and take over. And so Jesus has to withdraw from this volatile scene in order for the crowd to settle down. They saw the sign. They recognized that this was no mere man. And they seem to have got it, and yet what follows tells you that they completely misread the sign. They wanted to make him king by force. For them, the sign said in capital letters, B-R-E-A-D, bread. It was like they'd hit the jackpot. If this man was king, then life's sorted. That's it. Surely this is what we need. I can't wait 5 years for another election. I want him king now. Let's march on Jerusalem. Let's make it happen by force now. But Jesus points out to them that they're seeking the wrong things. They're looking in the wrong place. It was all about what Jesus can do for me. It's about how Jesus can serve me. How can life be better off if I've got Jesus in my life? And so in verse 26 and 27, Jesus has some fairly plain words for them. He says, very truly I tell you, you're looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Don't work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. Don't work for food that spoils, says Jesus. We're in a world where everyone is labouring for food that spoils, things that don't last. The holiday that's fantastic at the time, but you come back for 500 and more emails and all the jobs that you left to do that haven't been progressed because no one could be bothered, and you, why did I bother with that holiday in the first place? It's more hard work than it was if I didn't take it. Or perhaps the next car or the gadget that you think's fantastic, but very quickly just becomes part of the rut of life. The next promotion, the next relationship, all sorts of things that we chase after that satisfy for a while, but then leave you with that sense of emptiness. Just like physical bread that fills you for a time and then leaves you feeling hungry. It's a few years ago now, but I keenly remember walking behind my dad's coffin at his funeral. And then a few months later, it was my mum's, and again the same thing, walking behind the coffin, going into the service. It puts life in perspective. The finality, that sobering finality, the brevity of life, seeing these things in front of your own eyes. And with it that sense that so many of the things that I've worked for in life, so many things that I've experienced in life, so many things really don't matter. That ultimately, I've given so much time to things that ultimately don't last. And it's at times like that you really sense there has to be more than life. There must be something that ultimately satisfies. There must be something that lasts. There must be purpose somewhere. And we instinctively reach out for something more. And sometimes, even as Christians, it can make you stop and think, I've been looking in the wrong place for the wrong things. And Jesus says to the crowd, and he will say to you and me this morning, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. Just as bread is that basic stuff of life, that basic thing that we need for life. And just as we eat bread to be satisfied, so he says, I am the bread of eternal life. I'm that something that you reach out for. I am that something that you need. And he says, only he can truly satisfy. Whoever comes to me will never grow hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. A long time ago, the philosopher and scientist Blaise Pascal famously put it like this: there's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by God the Creator made known through Jesus Christ. We all know how bread satisfies, but how does Jesus satisfy? Well, he satisfies through the forgiveness of sins, the things that we've done, the things that we've thought, the things that we've said, the desires of our hearts, the things that make us unfit for heaven. He wipes away when we trust him. They're gone. They're finished. They are no more. He can satisfy because those things that make me unfit for heaven are gone. He satisfies through a new life. It's not just a slate wiped clean, but he gives you a new heart when you become a Christian. Attitudes change, desires change, I change. I have direction, I have purpose, life has meaning. You're at peace with yourself, you're at peace with the world, you're at peace most of all with God. And Jesus satisfies through a relationship with God himself. God is no longer the unknown and the feared, but you have a personal relationship with a personal God. Sometimes as Christians, we need to just remind ourselves, these are the things that really matter in life. These are the things that are the most important in life. So how do I make it mine? The folk ask that question in verse 28. They respond to Jesus, what must we do to do the works God requires? What must we do? That's a question that's been asked over the centuries. What must we do? We instinctively feel we have to do something. And sadly, many religious traditions reinforce that view, that you have to do to be right with God. And often as Christians, we fall into the same trap. That same instinct comes back into our lives. What must I do? It's as though I've got something to prove to myself, something to prove to others, something to prove maybe to God. Surely if I do more, I'll fit in better. I'll be more blessed by God because of it. But Jesus isn't interested. He says in verse 29, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. What I need, he says, is not to do. What I need is to believe. I need faith. I need faith. Faith is the simple key that turns and unlocks things in the Christian life. Just as we saw, faith sees who Jesus is. Faith understands what he can do and puts things in his life. And so faith is the key that makes these things ours. Jesus is saying to us, forget what you can do. He says, actually, you can't do anything. You're unfit for heaven and you can't do anything about it. Your life is in a mess. You can't do anything about it. And actually, you don't have to. Put it in my hands and trust me. All you have to do is to believe that I can sort the mess for you. When Jesus broke the loaves, Everyone, it says, was satisfied. They'd had enough and there was more left over. So what can Jesus do for you and for me this morning? Is it just enough? Does he just scrape me into heaven? Just good enough? No. He's able to satisfy and more besides. Everything you could need, you find in what Jesus can bring. The Lord of creation. Do we recognize who he is this morning, Christian or not? Are we putting him, the King of our hearts, as the Lord of all? A lesson from loaves. I can't, but he can. Are we struggling to stay in control of life? Are we ultimately trusting he knows best? However it turns out, he knows best. I put it into his hands. And the loaves that last. Are we seeking the true satisfaction, the things that really satisfy in Jesus Christ? Or are we trying to stuff that God-shaped vacuum in our hearts with things and experiences and things that never truly satisfy and can never last?